and welcome to our 8th panel session of the Greenlight Climate Festival, our second to last one of the day. This session will explore climate and international affairs and how people can identify business opportunities when combating climate change and addressing sustainability. How do we look at sustainability from a global perspective and climate change? I am joined by some amazing leaders in the space, including Rachel Kyte, Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts and former CEO of Sustainable Energy for All. I am also joined by, I apologize, I am also joined by Satya Tripathi, who is the Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations. Also with me is Paul Holthus, who is the President and CEO of the World Ocean Council. I am also joined by, sorry, just focusing on the cameras. I am also joined by Sanda Ojiambo, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Global Compact. And thank you all so much for joining us today. I know that we don't have a ton of time and you all have such amazing experiences and perspectives. So what I'd like to do is maybe just ask each of you to talk a little bit about yourself and the work that you do with your organization. And then we'll dive into the discussion and questions. And maybe we'll start with you, Dean Kyte.
Well, hi, hello everybody. It's lovely to be here. Thank you and congratulations on the event. So I'm a Dean of a Graduate School of International Affairs, where we teach the existential crises that we face, in particular related to climate change across all of our disciplines. So across international law, security, human security, obviously in climate and energy policy itself. And on and on. And this is an effort to be able to prepare graduate students for careers in international affairs, where you need to be rooted in the disciplines that are necessary to build those careers, but the challenges that are coming at you fast and furious now are complex, interdisciplinary, they are coming at warp speed, they are threat intensifiers of all kinds of aspects of an international affairs career, and they are, I think, being sped up by digitalization. So deep issues of equity and justice, it's not just about the green, it's about being green and fair. So after a career of international affairs in the World Bank Group, in the UN, in large international NGOs and in small startup NGOs, I've gone to try to prepare the next generation of leadership for the challenges to come.
Great, thank you so much, Dean Kyte. Maybe Satya, we could go with you next.
Thank you, Elliot. And greetings, everyone. I'm Satya Tripathi. I just finished my role as the UN Assistant Secretary General and the Secretary of the UN's Environment Management Group on the 31st of March. So it's just a few hours that I transitioned into a new role as the Secretary General of the Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet. We are the youngest startup in the climate and environmental space, but our ambitions are extraterrestrial. We want to produce $1 trillion of development impact in the next 10 years, because nothing less will do, as Rachel pointed out so eloquently, and I have been a great admirer of her work and a colleague from her time at the World Bank and of course with the UN. We really, I mean, it's coming at us at warp speed. We really need to act, and the threat multipliers will grow exponentially in the next 10 years. So I'm here to inspire, encourage every young person there is on this call, that you all need to become climate warriors of the most exceptional kind if we are to save humanity, not the planet, not Mother Nature. They'll take care of themselves. We need to really take care of ourselves, because that's what is under serious threat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Satya, and congratulations on the new role. Maybe Sanda, we can go with you next. Just tell us a little bit about you and your role at the UN Global Compact.
Sure, certainly, and greetings to you all who are joining us and my fellow panelists. So my name is Sanda Ojiambo, and I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. You know, a little bit about myself, I'd probably say I've spent 20 years playing in various stages and places around the development world. When I left graduate school, I was very keen to ensure that I would work in development. So I started working very hands-on in the NGO sector around the African continent. I then, to be quite frank, actually, I experienced travel burnout. And I just thought, wow, let me look at something different. And I moved to work in the corporate sector at a time when corporates were really getting attuned to the idea of business engagement and sustainable development. And I spent 12 years then working in a leading corporate in my home country of Kenya, really transitioning the work that the corporate did into more business-focused sustainable development outcomes, which was really exciting. And that actually led me to my current job in the UN Global Compact, where we work with businesses to see how they can adhere to responsible business practices, but also contribute to the sustainable development goals. So at present, there's 12,000 businesses that are members of the UN Global Compact, and we're really working to ensure that business does take its seat in addressing societal transformation, first by being responsible businesses and adhering to responsible business practices, and secondly, contributing through their products and services and operations to the sustainable development goals. So that's a bit about me and the UN Global Compact.
Thank you so much. And I apologize, there might be a lawnmower outside, so I hope you can all hear me. But maybe Paul, you could tell us a little bit about your work next.
Sure. Thanks, Elliot. Really happy and honored to be invited here and to be a part of such an esteemed panel and seeing friends and colleagues here. I am the founding CEO and president of the World Ocean Council. So we are the global blue economy business and investment organization. So focusing on that 71% of the planet that is the ocean and the businesses that operate there and their role and responsibility and opportunities in really shaping the future of the planet in regards to climate, as well as more broadly. My own pathway to that, and happy to kind of engage really here with the up and coming young professionals in the student population and elsewhere in the industry world. We've come to this, or I've come to this from a science and ecosystem management, environmental management background, but over the years, it really became clear that to address the ocean challenges, the key factor that was missing is the engaging of the business community. And so that led to the development of a global network of companies who then really requested that we set up a proper business leadership organization at a global multi-sector level to tackle the challenges of sustainable development in the ocean space. And within that work, then moving on to engage the investment community as the most important lever to the priorities for the business community. And so happy to talk a bit more about the ocean pieces as we move forward and the relationship to addressing the climate crisis. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and thank all of you for sharing your work and for your climate leadership in the space. And I think it's really great that all of you are here together, and you're all currently working, in a few different industries, so to speak, right? Whether it be in academia or in business or civil society or international NGOs. But I think there's a common thread of climate change that's come up a lot during this conference, and that is climate justice. And I was just wondering, and obviously climate justice, talks about how climate change has and will continue to have disparate impacts on the most vulnerable populations around the world, despite the fact that in many cases, they're not responsible for as many emissions of greenhouse gases. So I guess if you could all just take a few minutes to talk about within your own work, how do you address this issue of climate justice? And then maybe we can start with Sanda.
Sure, thank you. And thanks, Howard, for really just pointing out that, the climate crisis is here with us, and we are seeing that a lot of the world's most vulnerable communities are indeed some of the hardest hit. And I do believe from the perspective of the Global Compact that business and semi-society has a role to play in addressing this injustice as we go along. I think it's very important to continue to protect those who are most exposed and most susceptible to the impact of climate change. So there's a lot of work that we are doing around this area, and I'll just highlight a few of our campaigns. Of course, this year we have the COP26 conference coming up, and all stakeholders are rallying up towards this and really looking at how we can reach an agreement around firm and ambitious targets for carbon reduction and for decarbonization. But underlying that lies issues such as a just transition, which we could focus on issues such as the energy transition itself, but what are the social impacts around this transition? And I think that it's very important for businesses and stakeholders to also look at issues like this. It's important to transition jobs to different sectors and transition energy sources to different sectors, but we really do have to keep an eye out for what the social impact of this is. But on the other hand, as I said, I think there's a big role for business to play in taking ambitious and bold targets. We call it our business ambition for 1.5 degrees, to stake a claim that their business is going to really contribute to this carbon emission reduction, and then therefore contribute to reducing that gap between those who are impacted by this and those who are more negatively impacted, as you say, and face the injustices. So our call to business really is to really look out for how they can minimize their footprint, but do it in a way that really promotes a socially equitable and just transition.
No, thank you. And yeah, that's a great point you bring up, not just about the effects of climate change, but also, who's going to come forth and bring the solutions to climate change. Also, that's another really important aspect of climate justice that's often overlooked. And really the point of this conference is to make sure that, public university students or students from underrepresented backgrounds are able to access these opportunities, addressing climate change, fighting the climate crisis, making sure, and that'll help ensure that the solutions we come up with are also solutions that work for everybody. Maybe Paul, you can go next. Just tell us a little bit about, how does this climate justice issue fit into the oceans?
Sure. So a key part of what is the future, or current and future of the ocean, is about the coastal communities in Sanda's home country of Kenya and many other parts of the world. The vast majority of coastal communities depend on the ocean for protein, for livelihoods in other ways. And so ensuring that we've got a healthy and productive ocean is critical to those communities. And so addressing climate change and ocean change, which are interrelated and increasingly understood to be interrelated, and through the UNFCCC process, that's being picked up more and more. So to work with the business community as we do, to ensure that they are understanding and addressing their impacts to those coastal and marine ecosystems, working in partnership with coastal communities to ensure that we are minimizing, if not avoiding, and returning mangroves to their healthy and productive state, so that those mangroves can support fisheries, that they can serve their role in physically protecting coastlines from storm surge, the effects of cyclones and hurricanes, etc. That's the relationship between the role of industry in working with communities around that shared marine ecosystem. And this is an important part. Similar to climate, the ocean is a global commons. And so we need to look at it that way, and all stakeholders, from those local village fisher folks all the way up to the multinationals, are sharing that space and those resources, and need to work together on it being a healthy and productive component of the planetary ecosystem.
No, thank you for sharing. No, that's a really excellent point. Maybe Dean Kyte, you could go next and tell us a little bit about how climate justice relates to your work, whether it be in academia or I'm a big fan of when you were with you were the head of Sustainable Energy for All. Feel free to talk about it in whichever way you like.
Well, it's all interlinked. I mean, if we just take the access to energy issues, these are deeply domestic, right? And they're international. So, and we're all in recovery at the moment. Of course, here in the United States, we're trying to sort of read our way through the massive infrastructure program that was put on the table by the president yesterday and his team, understanding how that can be made to work for a more equal and just society and a greener one. And it's the same challenge overseas. And so as we try to engineer an international recovery from this extraordinary public health crisis under the pandemic, but also extraordinary financial debt and liquidity crisis around the world, we have one chance to get this right, because time's running out from an emissions perspective and a resilience perspective, and because we don't ever normally have this kind of understanding that we have to pump money into recovery as we do at this moment. And so I'm still an advisor to the Secretary General, and still work with a number of not-for-profits and investment funds on clean energy. And here we see that your ability to keep yourself cool in a world that's getting hotter, right? So cities around the world are becoming ovens. And so the traditional approach is to sort of build fridges that we live in inside an oven. Well, that's not going to work from an energy demand point of view. So access to non-polluting, hyper-efficient cooling, so that you can be productive. If it gets to a certain temperature, your productivity falls away very, very fast. It's also the way to keep our food safe, and it's the way to keep our medicines, and very importantly now, our vaccines safe. The technologies, the distributed technologies, the distributed renewable energy technologies, which we're starting to see lots of experimentation with in East Africa, in India, elsewhere, these are technologies which easily be deployed in the south side of Chicago, or in New York City, or in the South Boston, or in any inner city area in the US. So there is a link, there's a golden thread, which is that you need to have access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy. Without that, you can't grow an economy, green or any other color. And the final comment I want to make is that you will read a lot at the moment about all these net zero pledges that companies are making and countries are making. And this is sort of a good problem to have, because just a few years ago, the idea that we would pledge to net zero just seemed like extraordinarily like ambitious and fanciful. So here we are making these pledges, but we've got to be really careful, because the devil's in the detail, right? So what is in that pledge? How do people think they're getting to net zero? Is it based on science? Are companies using science-based targets, or are they not? Do they think that they're just going to offset in order to get there? Which means, do they think that somehow they're going to, this company will acquire assets probably in a long, long way at the other side of the earth, and that they will use the sequestration impact of that asset to allow them to keep on business as usual. So you're going to read a lot about net zero and whether it's real or not. I wrote something in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago about this. But the most important thing you have to remember is that it's deeply unjust for oil and gas companies residing or domiciled in Europe or North America to keep on business as usual, or slowly making their transition and using up all of the carbon budget that the developing world still needs, or low-income countries need, in order to meet the basic needs of their people. So at the very heart of the economic and financial engineering necessary for the race to net zero, we have to place equity. And you're seeing the great thinking on that is coming from the Economic Commission on Africa. It's coming from academics all around the world, but it's also coming from activists and UN officials very much living in low-income, middle-income countries. And so watch out for that, because I think it's a big debate, and we have a chance to get it right. The cost of getting it wrong will be not just a lost decade, but I don't think we get this moment again, frankly. This is the beginning of a race, and so it's important we start off on the right foot.
That's a great message for the students that are listening on the call, and that will be watching this, that really the time is now to take action, and that there is a moment, like where it's like when you roll a die, and there's a moment before before it hits the table, that if you breathe on it, it lands one way or the other. And so we're really at that moment. Mr. Tripathi, if you could just share with us, how does climate justice intersect with the work that you do, and how do you envision it moving forward in your work?
Well, I'll make 3 quick points. The first being that everybody sings praises of the Paris Agreement, but there's one fact that is not much talked about, is that it is celebrated because for the first time, every countries of the world came together and agreed on something. Now that something, interestingly, is 3.2 degrees of global warming, at which literally everything we understand and love will wither away. So the IPCC told us 2 degrees is a desirable state to be by the turn of the century. Then they revised it to 1.5 degrees because there's more science, more evidence that we need to stay at 1.5. Now the WMO came out with its own report, the State of the World's Weather Report 6 months ago, tells us that we actually have a 70% chance of hitting 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years, not 2100. That's the reality of what confronts us. And we have for, the road to nothing is paved with great conversations. So for 30 years, we've had great conversations at these COPs. We keep talking. And it's important in the multilateral process to talk, but it is time to produce results. And those results have to be based on equity, not equality. Equality doesn't work. The same thing for everybody doesn't work, because we have somehow been fixated on the carbon mitigation aspect, the climate mitigation aspect, to the almost near total exclusion of climate adaptation. Because if we had focused on adaptation, that's a people's narrative. And that's the second point I wanted to make, is that if it is about people, it's about lives, livelihoods, ecosystems, then we will get the mitigation we want. But this is like the climate equivalent of body shaming. Oh, you eat too much, you eat too little, you look too big or too small. It's the wrong conversation to have. If we focus rather on we all need healthy living, then actually we will get the mitigation we're looking for. We'll all be healthy. That's what we want at the end of the day, and the planet will be healthy in turn. And the third point is that the global economy, I mean, of course, once you get down to national levels, the numbers may vary a little, but 70% is in the private sector and 30% in the public sector. For far too long, we have focused on that 30% of the pie and presuming somehow naively that that is going to find the resources to solve an existential problem to humanity. We really need to turn our sights to the private sector, as Sanda so well put it herself, is that the money is there. If you take the top 300 pension funds of the world, and mind you, there are thousands of those, they manage $18 trillion in assets, and they all make long-term investments, and they want steady returns to be able to pay the pensions. If they put aside 5% of that money, that's $900 billion. That'll give us all the money we need to actually make the kind of difference by identifying the champions that have these transformative system scale ideas that can actually save all of us. So the possibility is right there, but the possibility lies in building those people and planet compacts around the world, not in daydreaming about conversations going to result in something. We have to act, and we have to act now.
That's a great point about really the urgency of the climate crisis, and you bring up that really interesting point about that perspective of climate justice, right? That it's not just the effect, but it's also the conversation that you're having, right? So whether you measure a country's emissions in terms of current, per annum emissions versus historical emissions, you get very different responses on, who is responsible for taking the brunt end of climate adaptation. And to your point about these pension funds, I often say that if we wanted to, if we could solve climate change tomorrow, it's not really an environmental problem. It's not even really a technological problem. If we wanted to tomorrow, we could deploy the plans to get 100% clean energy and carbon sequestration, all the solutions that we need. So really, it's a people problem. It's a social and economic problem, and it's also a political problem. Which brings me to my next question for all of you. And there's been some talk about COP and 1.5 versus 2 degrees and some of these international agreements. I'm curious to hear what do you think are the prospects for international agreements like Paris? Now that the U.S. has re-entered Paris, like, is this significant? What are the prospects for these kinds of international agreements to address climate change, and what's the extra step that we should be taking? Maybe Paul, will start with you.
Sure, thanks, Elliot. Well, I think I would, from my perspective, and having been involved with UNFCCC since its formative stages back when I was with UNEP in the 80s and early 90s, and building on Satya's points about the many decades of conversation and the need for action. I think the framework and the discussions and the agreements with Paris and moving beyond have really, they are achieving what they can, but there are limits to what that means in terms of the urgency and the level of action. And so I think the framework And the process there is fine. And that for the ocean, I would say that's augmented by, of course, the law of the sea and the current discussions around an amendment essentially to the law of the sea, the biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction piece. But that the key point here is for us certainly, and is the private sector role. So having, excuse me, having that essentially that governance framework, moving towards a more almost regulatory kind of framework is great. And business needs, as is often said and is very true, needs a certainty of that regulatory and legal and governance framework. So with that in place or being developed, and looking at the trajectory for that, certainly what needs to be done is to enhance, encourage, catalyze the role of the business community to really undertake its role. And for the ocean, the three key points there are helping support the ambitions of the Paris Agreement by delivering in three areas in particular. One is clean and low and no carbon energy. So the potential from the ocean, as we're seeing this boom in offshore wind, and now with floating offshore wind, is really going to expand that even further geographically and in terms of the volume, and the enormous potential for ocean renewable energy in the form of wave, current, and tidal and thermal energy. So huge areas for powering the planet from the ocean in ways that really address the climate crisis. And secondly, and Satya also mentioned the adaptation side. And so particularly for developing countries and small island developing states, the need to ensure that we have adapted and resilient coastal and port infrastructure as key to the economy of those countries, to the global economy. As we saw last week with the blockage of the Suez, anytime a port or critical piece of maritime infrastructure is out of commission, the economy of that area, if not the world, is affected. And so sea level rise, extreme weather events are a significant challenge to the viability and the operations of that global infrastructure, and certainly locally has a huge impact on local economies. And lastly, having the global governance framework through COP and through the other relevant mechanisms for the ocean is extremely important so that we can move forward with carbon dioxide removal from the ocean. The ocean is already the largest carbon sink. I think we all know here in the panel what an extremely dire situation we would be in if the ocean had not been absorbing heat and CO2 for the last several hundred years as societal inputs of CO2 grew. We need to now look at nature-based solutions applied at a significant scale in using the ocean. And these create then technological challenges and opportunities, but also important business development and investment opportunities. And getting back to this point about the funds that could be unlocked to develop what Paris Agreement calls negative emission technologies, and putting that to work in the ocean to achieve carbon dioxide removal and sequestration, hugely important for the future of the planet, for tackling the climate crisis and creating business and investment opportunities. So let's get the governance framework moving solidly, steadily, more aggressively, and more actively forward so that these business needs and opportunities can be de-risked and the business community can get on with its role.
Great insights. And to your point about business, maybe Sanda could talk a little bit about what this is going to mean from a business context, especially coming from an organization that tries to get businesses to basically promote these sustainable development goal, agenda.
And in a way, my response is really just going to draw on all of the incredible insights that the panelists have given. I think there's really two key imperatives for business. The first is we need to really look at climate financing and in a way that actually makes sense. I think it was Satya that mentioned that, if we put the resources in the right place, we can achieve an incredible shift. So that's the first. Second, I think the business needs to look at this with a clear sense of urgency. I think it was also mentioned that a lot of time has been spent in negotiation and in really discussing what the climate crisis is. I think right now we have the opportunity to act with urgency, and our call again to businesses to set ambitious targets and really look at, addressing those targets with a sense of urgency. Those would really be my two things. I think it's often been said, it's not really a choice between a livable planet and a global healthy economy. We actually really can have both. And I do think that when businesses take firm action on climate, that is the best way to really build that resilient business and spur economic growth. So for us, our real call to action is really, you know, let's walk the talk by how we allocate our resources, by the bold decisions we make, and also with a sense of urgency.
No, that's a great point. And I guess, you know, you mentioned kind of what are these different catalysts, what are the tools at their disposal to achieve these climate goals? And maybe Dean Kyte, you could talk a little bit about in your experience, you know, a lot of people were mentioning emissions, you know, how does that play into all of this, and how does that relate to your work? How can we basically achieve these goals of these international frameworks, and how does that relate to the work that you do?
Well, so the good news is what's at stake in the climate negotiations this year, which is scheduled to take place in Glasgow in November. But you know, nobody exactly knows how to bring, you know, tens of thousands of negotiators together under the current circumstances. And so the inequities are already, you know, like how do countries negotiate on Zoom if that's complicated? You know, for many low-income countries, small island developing states, they rely on lawyers and others who are the other side of the earth, and how does that all work? So there's all kinds of dynamics about how do we negotiate if we can't all be in person. But let's say that that everything goes ahead on schedule. Then there are three big things that have to be agreed, right? One is really around mitigation. So that's about having meaningful science-based net zero targets for mid-century, but really aggressive nationally determined contributions for the next 5 years, because by 2030 we have to cut 45% of the emissions. So we have to have urgent action this decade. Then we need to really get serious about building the adaptation and resilience capacity, especially of those who did nothing to cause this problem. So just by the dint of geography, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. So small island states, you know, the Philippines, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of South Asia, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, and vulnerable communities across the developed world, right? And then thirdly, we need a finance package. There are unmet promises from before Paris that were supposed to be realized last year that still haven't been met. Frankly, the low-income countries are sort of sitting there saying, well, you promised us this, you promised us that, you promised us access to vaccines, you promised us help. You know, not a lot of this is arriving you know, so we need some kind of package, but that has to relate to then the recovery package from COVID. So all of this is on the table at the moment. Many countries have committed, and I think what we have to do, and I saw there's some questions about sort of how does the fairness actually work in the system, is the question is, how do we continue to base ourselves on the science, and then how do you deal with the pieces of the puzzle which are sort of extra jurisdictional? So every country comes with a nationally determined contribution. If every country says, well, we're going to get to net zero because we're going to use somebody else's planetary space, then we're going to have to talk about that. So that's a governance issue, global governance issue. There's a global governance issue around the new technologies that we might use for the residual emissions that cannot be cut quickly and cannot be abated naturally. So, you know, if we're going to start, and you saw the newspapers about this recently, if we're going to start seeding into the atmosphere near the Arctic, you know, geoengineering, so that we lower temperatures, who governs that and who gets to say? There are more mundane global governance issues as well. In the next few years, we will be able to sit at our desktops, you in your offices, anywhere in the world, and you'll be able to pull up onto your screen a real-time map of emissions as they are being emitted from point sources, either from a peat bog in Scotland, or from permafrost monitoring of the tundra in Russia, or from a coal-fired power station still somewhere in Southeast Asia. But that information is going to be freely available to you or me, but it might not be available to the government civil servants sitting in the country closest to the problem. And so access to the data that can be used to make decisions is really important. Bringing that home to Tufts, we have something called the Climate Policy Lab, and what we're doing is looking at what is the policy recipe card? In what order do you need to do what things in order to speed your own transitions and be able to manage your own emissions, but then build your own resilience? So We kind of know what has to happen in the energy transition. We kind of know what happens in the transport transition. We kind of know some of what has to happen in food systems transitions, but pulling it all together and working out what you do in what order so that you don't have perverse effects is I think very important. If you do all of that, then business can do, as Paul was saying, the business of business.
Oh, it's great. That's great point, great insights. And I think before you were alluding a little bit to this notion of sovereignty, you know, especially when you brought up, you know, the small island developing states and kind of who bears the brunt, who's able to take the most action, and who's kind of left holding the bag, especially with these international negotiations. And to turn it over to you, Satya, I think this relates to your point earlier about how do you change the conversation from individual to planetary, that, you know, we have the capacity to work, but we're all kind of acting, and by we, I mean countries and nationalities, companies are acting in their own interests. And we're not seeing this as a planetary survival issue, as a planetary crisis issue. How do you change that perspective, especially as they relate to these international agreements or in general, international agendas for sustainable development?
Well, let me quickly share two examples that I was directly involved in catalyzing these processes. One was in Indonesia, where we set up something called the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility. The first project we catalyzed there was $350 million, a partnership with Michelin, the tire company, to protect a 400,000 hectare rainforest landscape, which, by the way, is roughly 7 times the size of the country Singapore in terms of scale. And they had already lost 88,000 hectares to plundering and illegal logging by using the 50,000 people that live along the margins of the forest or within the forest estate itself. So the partnership was with the people, actually. And there's not a single penny of government subsidy in there. And TLFF that was set up raised its money from public sources, all right. But we spent about $500,000 to catalyze the $350 million project. And now it has a multi-billion-dollar pipeline, actually, that will keep doing what it succeeded at doing. It employs 50,000 people, 16,000 directly in fair wages, and 34,000 through the secondary and tertiary sectors of the economy. Already the world's largest sustainable rubber plantation in 38,000 hectares run by Michelin subsidiary called RLU. And we took the same example to India, set up something called the Sustainable India Finance Facility. The first project is $2.6 billion in the state of Andhra Pradesh. 6 million farmers are converting to zero synthetic chemical farming, regenerative agriculture. As of now, 1 million farmers have converted. And in all this, the point I want to make is the government has played a phenomenal role. The role of a facilitator, the role of an enabler, and the role of a regulator, stepping away from the role of an implementer, because that's what governments do worst, what they do best. So they have stayed in the space. And I'm so grateful to President Jokowi and Pa Lohut, the coordinating minister for investments, and others who were massive help in pulling this through, and the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, the previous Chief Minister Naidu, and the current Chief Minister Reddy for doing this. And the women farmers there are an absolute inspiration to the rest of the world. So the solutions are there. And KfW, mind you, the German Development Bank, last year put $300 million into the India project at 0.5% coupon. Unheard of, even in development aid. And the numbers are growing. India has 160 million hectares of cropland. The Prime Minister is now very keen and interested. How do we take this and actually roll it out across the country? And now that I'm in India, visiting in my new role, I'm meeting with quite a few cabinet ministers over the next week, just to discuss that, what can we do together to actually get to where the impact is, and imagine what it will do, not just to mitigation. You're talking 160 million hectares of cropland, 140 million smallholder farmers, what it does to their bottom line, their families, their children, public health. I mean, I can't even, I get so excited every time I talk about it, the possibilities of how it helps people at the bottom of the pyramid. So I think the solutions are staring us on our face if we are bold enough to take on the challenge and do what is right. And that's where you build equity at the bottom of the pyramid.
That's a great point. And I think to, I guess, paraphrase, really focusing on people rather than, these processes is how you achieve these more equitable solutions. That's a really great point. And I know that we, only have about 5 minutes left on the schedule. So if it's okay with you all, I would like to just return to the audience. They've posted a couple of really great questions. The first question is for Dean Kyte. Somebody from the audience asked if you could speak more on the idea of reserving the remaining carbon budget for the developing countries, and how for developed countries, their allocated emissions is actually a lot smaller than they're currently targeting.
Yeah, so this is a very hot topic at the moment, which is and actually there was a conference yesterday co-hosted by the British presidency of the climate talks and by the International Energy Agency, and at that meeting, the current Indian Minister of Energy touched immediately on the point that the net zero commitments that are being made by the EU, the UK, and the expected net zero commitment that would be in a US plan that would be announced on April the 22nd, that that's not enough, that actually they have to be much more aggressive and in fact need to come up with negative emissions plans in order to allow the space for countries that haven't caused the problem and are still in processes of development. So this will continue to rage back and forth. I think that that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is making sure that there is integrity in the commitments, and that we're not all trying to use the same piece of planetary space. And how there are major challenges, I think, of global governance or fairness. One is making sure that all the sort of absorptive capacity of the planet isn't used up by oil and gas companies that don't want to transition out of their business. So forcing them to move more quickly. The second issue of fairness, I think, is loss and damage. This would be known as reparations in any conversation outside of a climate negotiation. And then thirdly, I think there are also issues of fairness in that there are resources on the planet which lie beyond national jurisdiction. So deep sea, the deep sea bed, where a lot of the minerals that people think that they will need to use for electrified economy, issues of blue carbon as the Antarctic ice melts, who gets to count that in their NDCs. There are some real jurisdictional or extra jurisdictional issues, and of course there are high seas issues and global oceans issues, which Paul knows better than I do. So I think that and then there is the issue of who governs the atmosphere, the stratosphere, and space when it comes to climate. So for those of you who are interested in the global governance dimension, the thing about climate change is it challenges us at the very local level, right? Who's going to install the community composter, all the way through to who's going to control geoengineering in space. There are many ways for you to get involved in the thinking about this. It's going to continue to unfurl, and actually for many of the students on this call, there's plenty of opportunities for you to shape the solutions.
Great, thank you so much, Dean Kyte. And I know we just have about a minute or so left, but I would love to hear from the rest of the panelists along these lines. What can students do that are on the call, that are going to be watching this video after? What can they do to get involved? To make changes in their communities, in their schools, in their, at their jobs? What are the best ways for them to get involved, and what advice would you give them? And maybe I'll pass it over to Satya.
Well, I think the advice I would give them is that it is their future we are talking about, and in many years ago, almost 4 decades ago, when I was in graduate school studying finance and economics, there was a concept called caveat emptor, buyer beware. So if you ignore your rights when you're buying things, you can't really come back and say, I have a problem now a year later. For young people, and with an apology from my generation that has done precious little to solve this existential problem for humanity, it is your time. Challenge us, stand up for your rights, and if you think leaders are not up to the job, find new leaders, because we can't complain if we don't engage. We need to break this conspiracy of silence. We do not talk about the climate breakdown enough around our dinner tables, around our community conversations, around our classroom conversations. So challenge yourself, challenge everybody around you to find the solutions. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Satya. Oh, that's a great point, and I'm sure that I hope that inspires the students who are on the call to action. Sanda, maybe do you want to offer some thoughts?
So, my view to the students on the call would be two things. I think, first of all, continue being a voice that holds people to account and holds businesses to account. I see somebody's written a question here in terms of penalizing organizations. I think one of the great things that happens in this world of digital citizenry is that it is very, conversations move very fast. And when companies are not doing what they need to do, I think consumers have spoken. They've spoken with their heels. They've spoken online. I think we do need voices to hold businesses to account. We try to do it within the Global Compact, certainly with our reporting frameworks, but I think it's a great added voice to just continue to have that citizenry and consumer pressure that is well-meaning, because it is where we are as decisions are being made for this current generation of students and the next to come. I think the second is continue to focus on the science. The science, I think, is what is going to guide us through this crisis. And I think that's a very important place to have our eye on. Those would be my two pieces. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanda. And maybe finally, we'll finish off with Paul.
Sure, thanks. Thanks very much. And to the students and young professionals, the up and coming generation here, I'd say there's tremendous opportunities to be a part of the solution here. Whatever pathway you take in your career, let's work on this climate crisis. And I would say from our perspective at the World Ocean Council, the blue economy is growing tremendously. It's a plan to program to double during this decade from what it was 5 years ago. And so I think there's an opportunity to get involved, to work with whatever sector you're interested in, government, public sector or private sector. Be a part of the solution by working within those organizations and entities. And in the business world, I'd say, and the ocean business world, from technology to science to business development to finance, there's work to be done. So get engaged and make this a part of your personal mission and work. And I'd really encourage you, and I think everyone here would agree, in particular, to work with and through the business community to help it be part of the solution that we need, because it is critical to the future of the planet.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. And I think for all the people that are on this call and those that are going to be listening in later, the key lesson here is that there's really a role for everybody to play, that there's boundless opportunities. And we said at the very beginning of the Greenlight Climate Festival that the size of the problem often correlates with the value of the solutions. And the problem is pretty big. So the solutions are also really, really big. No matter what if you're an English major, if you're you don't have to be an environmental studies major, you can be an economist, you can be a media arts major, you can be an artist. There's a million and one ways to get involved and to fight the climate crisis. And as we said earlier in this conversation, the time really is now. There's no time to waste. And just so you understand, for everybody on the call, how important this is, we have 4 global leaders in the climate space, really, truly, amazing thought leaders and people who have, profoundly shaped the climate conversation as we know today and continue to do this amazing work. And they are telling you, they are invested in you and they want you to get to work. So with that, I will just turn to our panelists and say thank you so much for taking the time out. We had a fantastic conversation. I know I've learned a lot and I plan on rewatching this a couple hundred times. And I hope you all have a fantastic day and enjoy the rest of the Greenlight Climate Festival.